When James denied a loan to a client, he had no idea the man wasn't just a businessman. He was someone capable of tearing his world apart. The moment he discovered who was really standing before him, it shook him to his core. But that was just the beginning. What happened next would change everything he knew about power and justice. And you won't believe how it all ends. James Turner, a seasoned banker in downtown New York, sat behind his polished mahogany desk, his sharp eyes scanning the files of potential clients. The city's financial pulse flowed through this office, and he was its gatekeeper. James was a man of routine, calculating, always skeptical, and quick to dismiss anyone who didn't meet the strict criteria set by the bank. The rules were simple, and James followed them without question. No exceptions. When Richard Blackwell entered his office, James barely glanced up. Richard was a tall man, his tailored suit hugging his broad shoulders, his stride purposeful and confident. He exuded the kind of quiet power that made people pay attention, though James didn't seem to notice. Richard had come for a loan, a simple enough request, but James wasn't interested in the details. Richard's credit score, while decent, didn't measure up to the bank's stringent requirements. That alone was enough for James to form his decision. "I'm sorry, Mr. Blackwell," James said, his voice sharp, almost dismissive. "We can't approve your loan. It's too high risk." There was a brief silence, the air thickening with the weight of the rejection. Richard's expression didn't change, though something flickered behind his eyes. A flash of frustration, perhaps, or disbelief. But James was too focused on the numbers to see it. Richard had come in with a plan, with everything in order, but none of it mattered. Not to James. Without a word, Richard stood up, his movements deliberate and measured. He nodded curtly, acknowledging the decision, but his eyes remained steady, unwavering. James returned to his paperwork, not noticing the quiet storm building within the man who had just walked out of his office. Richard's calm exterior concealed the fire that burned within him. He'd been rejected before, but this time felt different. There was something in James's tone, in the way he'd dismissed him so easily. Richard left the office without a word, but something in that moment had changed. An invisible line crossed. James wouldn't know it yet, but he had just set something into motion, a chain of events he couldn't undo. A few days after the meeting with Richard Blackwell, James Turner found himself in the middle of a quarterly profit discussion with his colleagues. The room was filled with the usual mix of voices, calculating, assessing, and scrutinizing every line on the spreadsheet in front of them. James had already begun to zone out, his mind still lingering on the recent loan rejection. But the calm routine of the meeting was shattered by the sudden ringing of his phone. It was the CEO himself, Thomas Greenfield. "James." Thomas's voice crackled through the phone, sharp and direct. "I need to speak with you. A Mr. Blackwell, whom you recently turned down for a loan. He's not just a client, James. He's a co-owner of this bank." The words hit James like a punch to the gut. His body stiffened as the blood seemed to drain from his face. Richard Blackwell, a co-owner? The man he had so coldly dismissed just days ago? It didn't make sense. James's mind raced, trying to reconcile what he was hearing with the reality he knew. How could he not have known? He gripped the edge of the table, trying to steady himself. 1,000 thoughts collided in his head. Had he been blind to the truth? How had Blackwell managed to remain so anonymous in the bank's operations? Richard had been just another client, nothing special, until now. As Thomas explained the situation further, James's world seemed to tilt. Richard Blackwell, along with a small group of investors, had quietly acquired a significant stake in the bank years ago. His wealth was vast, his influence quietly growing in the background. But what stunned James most was that Blackwell's financial acumen was impeccable, his wealth well managed, his investments shrewd. This wasn't just some random businessman asking for a loan. This man had built an empire, and now he held leverage over the very institution James worked for. James felt a wave of realization crash over him, the weight of his mistakes suddenly unbearable. He hadn't just rejected a loan. He had snubbed a powerful figure who had every right to expect respect and courtesy. The sharpness in Thomas's tone confirmed the severity of the situation. James had made a serious miscalculation, and now there was no undoing it. The following day, Richard Blackwell walked into James Turner's office once again. But this time, there was something different about him. The usual calmness was replaced by an air of quiet authority, an unspoken weight that seemed to fill the room. This was not the same man who had walked out days earlier, defeated but composed. No, this was a man on a mission. His mission was accountability. "I'm not the one who should be sorry, Mr. Turner," Richard said, his voice steady, carrying a sharp edge that sliced through the tension in the room. His gaze was unwavering as he took in James, now noticeably flushed, shifting uncomfortably behind his polished desk. "You made a mistake, one that could cost you far more than a loan." James opened his mouth, his words caught in his throat. He fumbled, attempting to stammer through an explanation, to justify his cold rejection, to deny any hint of prejudice. But Richard wasn't listening. The words James offered were nothing more than empty sounds, lost in the weight of the moment. "This is about more than just money," Richard continued, stepping closer, his eyes narrowing as he fixed James with a gaze that seemed to pierce through him. "It's about respect, something you clearly don't extend to people like me. But you'll learn. We don't need your loan. You, on the other hand, might need my goodwill." The words hit James harder than he had anticipated. The shock of the confrontation left him momentarily speechless, his usual confidence evaporating into the thick air between them. Richard didn't wait for a response. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the office, leaving James alone, his face burning with a mixture of shame and a simmering frustration that he couldn't shake. As the door clicked shut behind him, the reality of the situation hit James all at once. His mistake, his arrogance, hung over him like a dark cloud. He had misjudged not only Richard's financial worth, but his very character. James had crossed a line, and now the consequences of his actions were becoming painfully clear. The anger inside him was undeniable, but so was the deeper truth. He had underestimated a man who had far more power than he had realized. And now, that mistake might cost him everything. A week later, James received a letter from the bank's board. It wasn't an ordinary memo. In it, he was informed that his actions had been under review, and there were serious consequences. James found himself sitting across from Richard once more, this time not in his office, but in a large conference room. The weight of his situation pressed heavily on his chest. Richard's calm smile was the only indication that he had won this battle. The bank's board had acted quickly, and James was now under investigation for his treatment of clients, especially those like Richard. The lesson was clear. Power and privilege could be overturned, and James Turner had become the lesson. "I've decided not to press charges for the personal offense," Richard said, his voice steady. "But understand this. Respect is earned, not assumed. You can either accept that or find yourself on the other side of this bank's policies." With that, Richard walked out, leaving James to face the consequences of his arrogance. It was a harsh reality check, but in the end, James knew he deserved it. The sense of satisfaction Richard felt was palpable, leaving James with a newfound understanding of justice and how fragile his own position had been.